I'm Imran Garda. Welcome to our special coverage of Istanbul Syria summit. Leaders from France, Germany and Russia met with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan to discuss the war in Syria. The leaders were tasked with finding new ways to reach a political solution to more than 7 years of war. Let's hear what they had to say.
Our main priorities are ensuring a full ceasefire in the field and stopping the bloodshed as soon as possible. Also, we want to reach a political solution in line with the legitimate demands of the Syrian people and to re-establish stability in the country. We also discussed the return of Syrian refugees to their country. The return must be in line with international law, based on the willingness principle, be safe, and in coordination with the UN.
Turkey and Russia on September 17th made an agreement on a ceasefire in Idlib, and we committed ourselves to do our utmost to make sure that the armistice is sustainable and lasting, and we have achieved some results. We have made progress with regards to the demilitarization of the zones of the region around Idlib. We will not tolerate an attack with chemical weapons, which already happened during that war.
Despite the fact that the level of violence in Syria has been significantly reduced, it's still an important task to liquidate all the radical elements remaining there. We can't allow for the bandits who have got combat experience to continue their criminal activity, creating sleeper cells in our countries, recruiting supporters and preaching extremist ideology and terror.
We are all extremely vigilant to ensure that these commitments are met and that the ceasefire is stable and sustainable. We are on the same page with the Turkish president's plans on intelligence sharing and humanitarian aid, and we rely on Russia to put pressure on the Syrian regime.
Andrew, you listened to what each of them had to say. I presume I've got the joint statement with me on my phone right now. I presume you've got it as well. What can we say came out of this? Are they all on the same page and cautiously optimistic?
I would say, Imran, they are broadly on the same page. And if you're talking about sort of wide-ranging themes here, there's a lot of talk during that press conference of stopping the bloodshed, finding a political solution, increasing cooperation, respecting the territorial integrity and political integrity of Syria, and that for a political solution for this country, that this needs to be decided by the Syrian people. I think of all those statements, all those four leaders are probably broadly in agreement with these things. There's no particular detail of any specific initiatives at the moment from this meeting here in Istanbul, but one issue I think did dominate that discussion there, and particularly the questions that came afterwards, and that is the political solution. The constitutional committee that has been set up, or they're trying to set up at the moment, since the start of this year. And if this future of this country is going to be decided by the Syrian people, that's going to have to come together somehow. That is really the only game in town as far as that political transition is concerned. Now, the problem with this committee, this was set up by a declaration at Sochi at the start of the year. And so far, all sides involved have been trying to set it up. It's going to be involving about 150 people, 50 people appointed by the regime, 50 people by the opposition, and 50 people from civil society, which that part is going to be overseen by the United Nations. Now, only last night, sort of 9-10 months after this statement came out, Staffan de Mistura, the UN envoy to Syria, said that the regime was objecting to its involvement in naming these 50 representatives from civil society. Now, from this press conference, you still have the Turkish president and the German chancellor there saying they still very much hope that this committee is going to be set up by the end of the year. But bearing in mind these objections from the Syrian regime and the fact that Stefan de Mistura is going to be retiring next month, I think there is a bit of pressure on everybody here to try and make this happen by that deadline at the end of this year.
Yeah. Andrew, one more question for you. Can we say at the very least that they all highlighted that Idlib is working? It's not perfect, but the agreement as a microcosm for what can be achieved elsewhere in Syria in trying to put out this fire and stop the war, they're all happy that the Idlib agreement is holding?
I think, again, we can broadly say that they are, but the one proviso in all of this, and I think it's been the proviso for the last couple of months or so as this Idlib agreement came about, was what Vladimir Putin had to say there during that press conference. He was talking about how he and Russia reserved the right to help to protect the Syrian regime in this, and how it's important to still get rid of any radical or terrorist elements in Syria. He said there are still pockets around, and he's not just referring to Daesh, he's referring to Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham, which is present in the Idlib area, certainly has been present in the last few months and years. And this is the problem with the Idlib area, that the regime wants to go in to remove this organization, which is basically the former Al-Qaeda branch in Syria. But the rest of the international community really didn't want this to happen because of the effects that would have on the civilian population there. There was warnings of a massacre. So although the system is working at the moment in Idlib, there are problems ahead if the regime, the Syrian regime, still wants to pursue its agenda against HDS and it gets the backing of Vladimir Putin and Russia.
We have Oğuz Çelikol, the former Turkish ambassador to Syria. He's joining us from just outside where we heard the four leaders speak. Ambassador Çelikol, are you encouraged by what you heard?
Well, it is important that four leaders came together to discuss Syria and to find some solutions. Because Turkey and Russia has already been cooperating, but now we are having another format. France and Germany is joining this format, and they are talking about the future of Syria. This is encouraging, of course.
Tell me, because you know how Bashar al-Assad thinks better than others, you knew how his father thought, you know how the family thinks, and by virtue of that, how the system there thinks. If they were watching this communique, if they were watching this press conference as the Assad regime, what would they be thinking? Would they be thinking their survival is more likely or less likely?
Well, that will depend on, of course, how Russia is going to act from now on, because they have been so far supporting the Assad regime and the military process they have been taking in Syria. But the pressure on Syria is also increasing. And the balances in Syria between Russia and Iran is changing. So we have to wait and see. But this constitutional committee is important because that will be the beginning of a political process in Syria.
Here's what those main outcomes are again. Let's try to make sense of this. The leaders of all four countries highlighted the need to create conditions that would allow for the safe and voluntary return of refugees. Agreed. They also expressed a determination to reject separatist agendas aimed at undermining the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria. There was a push for the importance of a lasting ceasefire while underlying the need to continue fighting against terrorism. And a Syrian-led political process facilitated by the United Nations was also discussed. And they called for a constitutional committee for Syria to be established as soon as possible. From France, we're joined by François Burkhardt, a member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. From Germany, we have political analyst and EU expert Klaus Jürgens. And we have Alexander Domrin, a professor at Russia's Higher School of Economics, Faculty of Law. He's just here to my left, closest to me. Gentlemen, you've been with us all day. We've been speculating as to what we were going to hear from that communique. I just want to talk to one of you before we move on to something else. So I just want to jump in a little bit here, François. Just your immediate take. Were you surprised by any of that?
Let's be respectful to the fact that there has been an effort. We should not be too critical. The mere fact that there has been no setback or step backward, the mere fact that Idlib has been upheld is positive. Okay? Now, when it comes to the hard core of what is required for any reconstruction of Syria, no, I'm afraid I've not been surprised, and there has been no major step, because allow me just to say that the story of the constitution does not sound to me as very important. Why? Because Syria has a constitution. The problem is not the constitution. The problem is not improving the constitution. The problem is that the constitution should be respected by the ruling elite, which has never been the case.
But that horse has bolted. Everybody's agreed now they need a new constitutional committee.
I'm afraid that this is a way to say words who do not grip the core of the problem. The problem is that we need to move from military to politic approach. For political to be in the agenda, we need a balance of forces, which makes that the two sides are going to have negotiations. There will be no negotiation if the balance of forces is completely unilateral. It is the case now. And I see absolutely no reason now, at the end of this meeting, for the balance of forces on the ground, the military balance of forces, to change in the near future. Therefore, the idea that there will be a new constitution does not sound to me as a credible response to the requisite of the situation.
Okay. Alexander, let me begin with you. While they were broadly on the same page, I think the most stark differences came from what we can call the Russian perspective versus the others. Did you expect it to be that way?
Yes, absolutely. That's why, from the very beginning, from the very first segment, that we had about 5 hours ago, something like that. My point was that we have different perspectives. I don't expect that by the end of the day, all 4 participants representing 4 different countries will be on the same page. Another very important detail, of course, is that at this moment we can evaluate the summit only by press conference. I haven't seen that communique yet.
Yeah, I've got it with me. I mean, it's very brief, and I'll share it with you as well. Let me give you one of the things, right? And I just got this now on my phone. One of the interesting things here is that from the very beginning, and something we spoke about earlier on, is that Russia differed with the others on who is a terrorist group or not.
Right.
Now, coming out of the summit, I'll read this to you exactly. It says, they reaffirmed their determination to fight against terrorism in Syria in order to ultimately eliminate Daesh/ISIL or ISIS, al-Nusra Front, and all other individuals, groups, undertakings, and entities associated with Al-Qaeda or Daesh/ISIL and other terrorist groups as designated by the UN Security Council. Isn't that a change of policy from Russia? Because it's now Daesh and Al-Qaeda, just like many of the others believe.
These are terrorist organizations recognized as terrorist organizations by Russia. And actually, you know, even according to the Russian legislation, you cannot even mention ISIS or Daesh without referring to them as terrorist organizations banned in the Russian Federation.
Although in the past, in this war, for example, the Russians have attacked the Free Syrian Army, for example, in the past, and other groups that are not considered Daesh or al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, etc. So is that a change from Russia?
You know, the problem here is that different organizations change their names so frequently and so easily that today they're called Free Syrian Army. Tomorrow they will be called something else. So technically, what does it change?
So it doesn't change anything for you?
I don't think
I mean,
so.
that was pretty interesting. Okay, so Klaus, there's a lot to talk about, and we're sort of going to navigate a bunch of things here. I'm looking at the Quadrilateral Summit joint statement, and I'm also looking at my notes from what we heard, from what everybody said. Let's go to what your Chancellor said, right? Did you see any shift in the German approach to Syria based on what you heard in her press conference?
Well, I would dare to make a kind of delicate balancing act. Shortly before today's meeting, the defense minister, Mrs. von der Leyen, said that basically the Assad regime resembles not only undemocratic movements, but she almost used the word dictator. Now, Mrs. Merkel, as I mentioned earlier today, would not go that far. It is not official government policy, but by her being there and participating in the meeting and, of course, in the press conference, I do see a huge shift in domestic understanding of the seriousness of this conflict.
She's mentioned there are two fights, and she and Macron both mentioned it. They said the one is against terrorism and the other one is the regime against its own people.
Yes.
What does that tell you?
This would underline the comment I made a few minutes ago. There is an underlying consensus that the Assad regime indeed not only made mistakes, but embarked on a war against large segments of their own people. And now what can be done? One option is to say there will be no new Syria with Assad. The alternative is, let's go to the Constitutional Committee, hoping that, if I may look into the direction of my esteemed colleague here from Moscow, hoping that Mr. Putin will convince Assad that the 50 NGOs and civil society representatives have to be on board. Now, if only he would say this, perhaps he would not necessarily listen. But now it's not only he and it's not only Turkey. All of a sudden we have Germany and France. And you can't have these two European superpowers going into the debate, trying to help to solve the conflict, knowing they would fail. This is the realpolitik I always think about. I think it is a huge shift from the German side to participate. Hopefully it underlines a shift in policy making, but there is a clear tendency, from what I read between the lines, not being happy with what the previous Assad regime has done. There is a great worry.
Right.
How will this play out well, of course, there will be free elections one day.
Right.
Now, assuming it will be a majority, what would happen then? Yes,
Right.
I know. They're not going so far to say block him automatically from all elections. But what they say is the constitution must be so democratic that there are at least chances for a free and fair and democratic election based on a civilian constitution.
Right.
I think this is a very clear statement. This is policy making. Let's hope that it will work out. It would be a first step. Will it happen by the end of this year? It's very, very, well, courageous to say so. But I think there is some truth in it. When you have these two European countries joining, I'm not saying that what the countries who did it before did something wrong. Of course, to the contrary. But it adds a new dimension. It adds a new weight. You mentioned the Assad family now sitting and watching. They can't just sit back anymore and say, this is a local conflict, and if at all, we have to deal with Turkey. All of a sudden, they have to deal with the European Union.
But they still had a strong supporter in Vladimir Putin. So we have the Le Monde journalist from your country, Francois, asking Vladimir Putin from your country, Sir Alexander, what measures can be taken to make Assad more accountable? Essentially, asking it to the right person, because in the power dynamic, Putin has more power over Assad. We all know that, right? And Putin says you need to respect him. You can't call this a regime. Was that the right answer from Vladimir Putin?
Absolutely.
Why?
And by the way, the whole term accountable sounds like, criminalization of the Syrian government.
500,000 people have died on his watch over the past 7.5 years.
Did he start that war against his own people?
He's not accountable at all for any of it.
He is a hostage of the situation. It was not him who began war against his own people. Am I right or not?
I don't think you're right.
Okay. Now, when Frau Merkel says something about chemical attacks, is she sure that Assad, is responsible?
There seems to be a consensus.
Accountable?
There seems to be a consensus, at least from the other three parties on that panel today.
I don't represent those three different parties. I represent
from Turkey, from France, from Germany.
You invited me to speak on behalf of Russia.
No,
right?
no, certainly. But I mean,
yes.
so in terms of context, when she mentions chemical weapons, she's saying red line was crossed, and we can include the Americans and others who also believe that, and not just the Obama administration, but the Trump administration now as well, that Assad used chemical weapons on his own people. You dispute
We don't
that?
think so.
Okay.
Okay, then, I definitely agree with certain things, and there were some common things in the presentations of all four sides of the summit. Syrians will decide their own future. Syrians will decide their own future, but also with the condition that we can create conditions for the Syrians to solve their own future. Now, Constitutional Committee. That's probably the only technical detail that can be considered as a kind of a roadmap. Even though you remember from the very beginning, I've never used this term roadmap. There was no roadmap during this press conference, so maybe there is kind of a roadmap in that communique. And now, 2 months. 2 months, guys, come on. It's absolutely unrealistic to write a constitution in 2 months. Moreover, when you have so different participants, like 100 people representing three different sides of the Syrian population.
So, okay, so Francois, you agree then, that this is too hopeful?
That's not realistic.
Not realistic, too hopeful?
Say it again.
Couple months to get together,
by
have
the
this
end of the year.
constitutional committee, try and figure. Okay, let me put it to you this way: by Christmas time, major rapid developments leading the Syrian war on the path to being resolved. Is that possible? Spearheaded by these four countries, yes or no?
No, I'm afraid no.
So are we just wasting our time?
I'm afraid no, once again, because as I told you, the problem in Syria nowadays is not to invent a constitution, is to make the balance of forces such as he who does not deserve to be called a government for very objective reasons.
In what way?
In what way? I will tell you. For the government to respect the rules of this constitution, there has to be a process of negotiation. For a process of negotiation to exist, there must be reasons for he who is in the situation of total victory to negotiate. There is absolutely no means of pressure from the Russian side. Why I have a problem with your approach. It happens that I was living in Syria.
Good.
It happens that this part of the world which you are addressing from a legalist point of view, I'm also a lawyer, but I know that law sometimes has to be fed by life. It happens that I have spent 25 years in this part of the world, which you address from a legal point of view. And I can tell you that the balance of forces which is expressed nowadays inside Syria is not a balance of forces of the Syrians, of a part of Syria against the other part. It's a balance of forces of two major foreign intervention, Iranian and Russian, again, weak foreign intervention on the side of the West. It's not a balance of inside Syria. It's no longer a Syrian crisis. It's a crisis between Putin being a strong man in terms of intervention and the Westerners for many intricate reasons do not supporting. So the categories of the legal system have been emptied of their meaning. And now I'll just say, you have said it, I want to say it again because it wraps up the entire incommunicability. You have told us, sir, and I want to repeat it, you consider that Bashar al-Assad has been re-elected democratically in 2014. Now, I don't need to add one more word. I know that all of the listeners in the entire Arab country, they know what I mean, and they don't understand what you mean.
A fascinating day for all your countries, plus Turkey, where we are right now, and undoubtedly, hopefully, an opportunity for the Syrians watching here to see a possible end to the war that has ravaged their country for 7.5 years. I'd like to thank my guests once again for joining us here on this special Istanbul Syria Summit program here on TRT World. I thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure having your company. Stay with us right here on TRT World. Bye-bye.